Sami, thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
All right, so, I mean, the list is long, but I guess there really is only a handful of serious contenders.
That's right. I think that it's important to understand the scale or the magnitude of what is unfolding before us. These were parties that were pointing the gun at each other, that were shooting each other left, right, center, plunging the country into war. And now it appears that there is a new medium through which the Libyans will decide their leaders. Whatever obstacles there are in assuring a fair and just process is a different issue. But the reality is that now there is an alternative medium aside from war, aside from the gun, at least temporarily, at least for the foreseeable future, in which scores will be settled. Haftar, Aguila Saleh, Fathi Bashagha, Abdelhamid Dabeiba, the Prime Minister, Seif el Islam Gaddafi, the son of the former Libyan leader Muammar Ghaddafi. All of these candidates now will be competing with one another at the ballot box. They will be seeking to achieve enough votes by which they will then be able to entrench their power. And I think that in this regard, this is something to celebrate, even if elections themselves will not necessarily solve the problems that have riven Libya and that have caused such discord in Libya. But nevertheless, it's important to stress that this is the first time we will have elections since 2014. It's also the first time we have elections in which the international powers are very keen to see them take place. By that I mean specifically the US, which is not interested in the outcome, more interested in that the process actually takes place. And this is why I know I sound optimistic with the elections. I'm optimistic in that it's a sign that things are moving towards a dialogue, or things are moving towards an environment in which things are not settled by the barrel of the gun. But that doesn't mean that we might not slide back into war. It doesn't mean that the elections will be recognized. It doesn't mean necessarily that there will be national reconciliation, but at least it shows that the tectonic plates in the Libyan political scene are shifting at least towards something, at least towards some respite for the Libyan people.
All right, and I think you may be sort of partially answering my next question, which really at the end of the day is, if the elections do go ahead, you've got people like General Haftar, who I'm pretty sure is not going to accept any results except him becoming president. So with that in mind and the splits in the country, will we not have a worse situation post an election, because there will be people who will now be fighting over the results, and we might be worse off than we were before the election?
My answer will be very controversial, and I think I will caveat first by saying that my answer does not mean that I approve of this particular scene or that I approve of the consequences of such an opinion. But you've asked me for my view and my analysis of it. In 2014, it was not Haftar who rejected the results of the elections. The ones that rejected the results of the elections were the parties and militias of Tripoli. When the Government of National Congress, very brief history, it will not take very long, when the National Congress that ruled from 2011 to 2013, the dominant parties that were the Islamist militias, and I resent to use that term, but we use it in the context just to differentiate between the parties. The Islamist groups believed that they were going to lose in elections. They had failed in the 2 years to deliver on the promise of the revolution, and they believed, as was the case in Egypt, in Tunisia, and the like, that the Islamists were under pressure, that if they go to elections, they will lose. So they decided to try to unilaterally extend the mandate of the Congress, essentially trying to prevent elections from taking place. Haftar used this as an opportunity to begin a military campaign, not because he cared about democracy, but because he found a very good excuse or very good umbrella to launch his campaign. When elections did take place in 2014, these Islamist groups lost, even though there was a low turnout. So what happened was that they took up arms and prevented the new parliament from taking their seat. They surrounded the Supreme Court to get the results annulled, and then they went to seize the capital, Tripoli, and then the new parliament went to Haftar seeking protection, and that emboldened Haftar and gave him some sort of political legitimacy by which he could pursue their ambitions. My point is that in 2014, it was not Haftar who rejected the elections, and this time, Haftar is not the most likely party to reject the elections. In fact, Haftar and Aqil al-Saleh and Seif el Islam Gaddafi and all the anti-democratic elements have said they are ready to work in the elections because they believe that they can win those elections. They believe they have enough support to win the elections as a result of nostalgia amongst some of the Libyans with regards to a time in which there was actual stability, and also as a result of this perception that Haftar as a strong man might actually bring stability to Libya, even if it is a twisted concept, in my opinion. The statements that are against the elections are actually coming from Tripoli. You have El-Mishri, the head of the Presidential Council, who said on Al Jazeera 2 weeks ago that if the elections produce a win for Haftar, we will take up arms and go back to war. You have other militias that are openly saying that if the Electoral Commission accepts the candidacy of Seif el Islam Gaddafi and Haftar, then there will be an armed insurrection to remove this election committee. Dabeiba, the current Prime Minister of the Government of National Unity that was imposed by the political dialogue that was overseen by the UN, Dabeiba has spent months trying to get these elections delayed. He's been lobbying the United Nations to say, we don't want these elections to take place. And the US have told him, I don't care what you say, we want these elections to take place. And this is why, remarkably, in this very strange, twisted game that is Libyan politics, it's actually Haftar and Seif el Islam Gaddafi who want these elections to go through, and not the popularly touted democratic parties of Tripoli that want these elections to go through. And this is why the greatest threat, in my opinion, and it pains me to say it primarily because I do believe that Haftar has been a detrimental and destructive influence on Libya. It pains me to say it, but the greatest threat of war comes not from Haftar in the aftermath of the elections, it comes from the factions in Tripoli. And I'll finish on this point, Peter, a very important point, which I ask the viewers to consider, which will give them a better idea of the Libyan political landscape. The factions of Tripoli have been infighting since 2011, killing each other and competing with one another. And even when Sarraj, the former prime minister, was agreed upon in a dialogue, the militias lined up on the coast to prevent Sarraj from entering Tripoli. He had to arrive out of the city by night and sneak into the capital behind them to take up his post. And the only time that the militias ever united in Tripoli was when Haftar was knocking on their doorstep about to eliminate all of them. Now I ask the viewer to compare this with the east of Libya, where Haftar was able to march all the way to Tripoli and not worry at all about any backstabbing that might take place in eastern Libya. In other words, Haftar managed through force, through money, through whatever it is, to at least unite what was once believed to be an area that could not be united. And this is why Haftar and Seif el Islam Gaddafi stand a chance in the elections. It is that the Libyan may not necessarily be interested in democracy anymore. They may be interested in stability, in security, and we're already seeing in Tunisia, we see the president who suspended the constitution in the name of promising employment, and the Tunisians don't necessarily care about the democratic process anymore because it hasn't provided the jobs. There is a fear that this election will be driven by these concepts, and the reality is, and this is the unpopular opinion that I asked people to forgive me in the beginning, and the caveat, the unpopular opinion is this: it may well be, according to what I see in Libya, and it's heartbreaking to say this, that even if the elections are not rigged, Haftar and Seif el Islam Gaddafi are front runners. Haftar could actually win these elections, not by a majority, but he has the potential to come first without the elections being rigged. And that is why the Tripoli parties are panicking. That's why they want the elections delayed, because they are looking in Morocco and they see that their Islamist allies have lost fairly in the elections. The Moroccan Islamists went from 125 seats to 12 seats. They've seen in Tunisia that the president has suspended the constitution with a significant number of popular support. They've seen that Turkey, which was an ally of the Islamists, is reconciling with the anti-democratic elements of the UAE, of Egypt, these parties that spent heavily to destroy the democratic process in the Arab Spring. The reality is that when you look at the momentum, it is in Haftar's favor, be it militarily or politically, and that's why the answer to your question is rather, it is not Haftar who threatens the peace in the aftermath of the elections, it is the Tripoli factions. And I hope my answer had some nuance to suggest that that doesn't mean I support Haftar at all.
All right, so Seif el Islam Gaddafi entering the race. Has that complicated the politics of Libya, or is Haftar, do you think, so far ahead, or what could possibly happen?
I think it's important to highlight that the front runners are all Gaddafi-era politicians. You have Haftar, you have Seif el Islam Gaddafi, and even in the West, even in Western Libya, the front runner is Abdelhamid Dabeiba, who made his millions, him and his family, under the Gaddafi era. It appears that the front runners, or the most likely to win the presidential elections, at least according to popular opinion, will be somebody from the Gaddafi era. So that says a lot about where we are today with Libya, in that 10 years on from the NATO-backed insurrection against Gaddafi, or revolution, call it whatever you wish. The opposition that was delivered to power by the NATO intervention has not managed to provide an alternative vision for Libyans to believe in. And here is perhaps where we see Seif el Islam Gaddafi complicating the affairs, in that one assumes that it is Haftar who will be disturbed by Seif el Islam Gaddafi. And it's true perhaps that Gaddafi might take votes from Haftar. But there is an interesting video that was spreading on Libyan social media of an individual who was holding the voting card in a video and saying Dabeiba, referring to Libya in the West, the current prime minister of the government of national unity, a Libyan citizen saying, Dabeiba, I'm very sorry, I like you, but I will vote for Seif el Islam Gaddafi, implying that they prefer Gaddafi over him. That's not reflective of wider Libyan public opinion, but rather it is to emphasize that Gaddafi may not just take votes from Haftar in the East, but may also take votes from Dabeiba in the West. Dabeiba, who is seeking to become president, who's seeking to establish some coalition whereby to rival Haftar. And it's believed that the UAE tried to mediate between Dabeiba and Haftar on the basis that they would be the front runners. So I think that in this context, Gaddafi is definitely a curveball. I wouldn't rule him out. I don't necessarily think he will win, but he will certainly complicate the process. And I think perhaps the testament to these elections, or rather to the ability of these elections to upend the political dynamics and help Libya enter a new chapter, whether that's war or peace is a different issue, but the potential of the elections to really upend the dynamics is made clear in that no one can predict the result. No one is certain who will win. No one can put their finger and say it will be Haftar or Seif el Islam Gaddafi or Dabeiba or Fathi Bashagha or whoever. And I think that goes some way to encourage people to at least celebrate how far Libya has come since the bloodshed that was spilt. But we're still in a very treacherous territory. We're still moving forward very slowly, but it does appear at least that things are moving. And when things are moving, I believe that is better than it being a status quo or in a stalemate.
All right. The international community have been pushing for these elections quite hard. And I just wonder what's in it for them. Are they on the same page when we consider America, Europe, Russia, even China?
I think when we say the international community supports elections, I think it is Germany and the US that support elections more than anybody else. I think the Biden's attitude is more that there is no difference between the Libyan parties. There's no difference between the war criminal that is Haftar, as in, I'm not saying he's a war criminal, but the other accusations levied at him. There's no difference between war criminal Haftar or terrorist, between quotation mark, parties in Tripoli. There's no difference between them or the roaming militias that are taking place in Libya. The US doesn't differentiate. It believes that all of them are to blame. All of them are chaotic parties. None of them are dependable. None of them can be relied upon. The only thing the US is worried about is that this war has enabled Russia to expand. This war has enabled Russia to establish another military base that overlooks the Mediterranean after it established a military base in Syria, in Tartus, and after it is warming with Turkey, a NATO ally, and establishing good relations with Turkey that will enable Russia to exert more influence over the Mediterranean. For Biden, the conflict is irrelevant. What is important is to push back against Russia, and that requires the war to end in Libya. And Biden believes the best way to do that is through elections, and he's not tolerating any spoilers at all. Anybody who spoils it will be sanctioned. France has been told to rein itself in. The US has been telling France that its competition or its support for Haftar and the like needs to be reined in, primarily because it wants these elections to succeed. And Paris is essentially saying, okay, but I want some of my interests to be established in Libya. And that's why we saw Kamala Harris attend the Libya conference in Paris, sort of to suggest that, guys, whatever happens here in Paris, I'm here to remind you that Biden wants elections to take place, and that message is being heard loud and clear. Turkey, there will be some concern, primarily because their presence is built upon agreements that were signed under Sarraj. The fear is that if Haftar wins, he will cancel these agreements, and then the issue of enforcement of these agreements will become an issue, primarily because Haftar is likely to find support from France, support from Egypt, even support perhaps from Washington, who have suspended his case in the courts that are accusing him of war crimes. He might find support from Washington to help him push out Turkey. So Turkey will be concerned, given that there is this maritime chokehold, which was the reason it intervened in the first place. Russia, of course, will not be especially concerned. Russia believes whatever happens in the elections, it's staying. The US will not exert the necessary resources to oust it. The US is trying to contain Russia, not push it back. It's not willing to deploy those resources. And that there is a scenario in the elections in which, if nobody likes the results, i.e. between the Libyan parties, then Libya will be split between East and West. And in Eastern Libya, Russia will be able to maintain its influence while Washington maintains influence over Western Libya. So the international considerations are still there, but it does seem that Biden is imposing discipline, at least for now, at least until the elections take place. Bear in mind, it's not guaranteed the elections will even take place. There's still a suggestion it might be delayed until March. This idea is still being touted, but it does appear that the international community is concerned about Russia, is concerned about Turkey's expansion. This is what is driving the aggression within which Biden is forcing the idea of elections, but it's not guaranteed that Biden will have his way.
Sami Hamdi, always great talking to you, my brother. Thank you so much indeed. Your insights greatly appreciated. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
All right, that's Sami Hamdi, one of our regular contributors there, talking about the election deadline. Over 60 candidates have put their name in the hat, but it does seem to be just a few, perhaps, that are serious contenders for an election, which may or may not happen. But as Sami Hamdi was saying, there is movement, and there is movement towards a certain direction, and perhaps that's the biggest gain from the developments in Libya at this time.